In Beaumont, a late-night shooting in a residential neighborhood has now escalated into a full murder case, ending with a young suspect surrendering to police after a warrant was issued for his arrest. Authorities say Rudolph Lassaint, 31, was found suffering from gunshot wounds in Beaumont's South Park area. Emergency responders rushed him for medical treatment, but despite their efforts, Lassaint later died from his injuries. His death transformed the investigation from a shooting inquiry into a homicide case. As detectives worked to reconstruct what happened, police identified a suspect and obtained a murder warrant. That suspect, Charles Siggers, 18, became the focus of an active manhunt, one that ended when he voluntarily turned himself in to authorities. He is now being held on a $1.2 million bond, underscoring the seriousness of the charge he faces. Investigators have not yet detailed a motive, but officials confirmed that the shooting occurred in a neighborhood familiar to residents as South Park, an area now grappling with the aftermath of sudden violence. Police presence increased as detectives canvassed the area, collected evidence, and appealed for information from anyone who may have witnessed events leading up to the shooting. For Lassaint's family, the case marks a devastating loss, one that unfolded quickly and publicly. For the city, it raises renewed questions about gun violence, youth involvement in serious crime, and how rapidly disputes can escalate into deadly encounters. This is the story of a man found shot, a suspect who turned himself in, and a community waiting to learn what led to a fatal moment in Beaumont's South Park neighborhood. The fatal shooting of Rudolph Lassaint, 31, unfolded with alarming speed, transforming a late-night emergency call into a homicide investigation that would soon grip Beaumont. What began as a report of a man down in the South Park neighborhood quickly escalated as first responders arrived to find Lassaint suffering from gunshot wounds. Police say Lassaint was discovered injured and in urgent need of medical care. Paramedics worked to stabilize him and rushed him to a nearby hospital. Despite those efforts, he later died from his injuries, prompting detectives to reclassify the case as a murder. Within hours, the area where Lassaint was found became the center of an intensive investigation, marked by police tape, flashing lights, and a growing crowd of concerned residents. South Park is a residential part of Beaumont, where neighbors often know one another, making the violence particularly jarring. Officers canvassed the area, speaking with potential witnesses and searching for surveillance cameras that might have captured the moments before or after the shooting. Shell casings and other physical evidence were documented as investigators began reconstructing the timeline. As details emerged, detectives identified a suspect and moved quickly to secure a murder warrant. Authorities named Charles Siggers, 18, as the individual sought in connection with Lassaint's death. Police circulated the warrant and issued public notices, urging anyone with information to come forward, while warning that the suspect was considered armed and dangerous. The manhunt, however, did not end with an arrest at a traffic stop or a forced entry. Instead, police confirmed that Siggers voluntarily surrendered to authorities after learning of the warrant. He was taken into custody without incident and booked into jail, where he is currently being held on a $1.2 million bond, a figure that reflects both the severity of the charge and the court's assessment of risk. Investigators have not publicly released a motive or detailed the relationship, if any, between the suspect and the victim. In the early stages of a murder case, such information is often withheld to protect the integrity of the investigation and potential future court proceedings. Detectives continue to review evidence, including witness statements and any available video, to establish what led to the shooting and how events escalated. For Lassaint's family, the loss has been sudden and devastating. Friends described him as a familiar face in the community, and tributes began appearing online as news of his death spread. As is often the case in violent crimes, loved ones are left grappling not only with grief, but with unanswered questions about why it happened and whether it could have been prevented. Police officials emphasized that the surrender of the suspect represents only one step in a longer legal process. With charges filed, the case now moves into the court system, where prosecutors will be required to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That process can take months, involving pre-trial hearings, evidence disclosure, and potentially a jury trial if no plea agreement is reached. The shooting has also renewed local concern about gun violence and the involvement of young people in serious crimes. At 18, Siggers sits at the boundary between juvenile and adult accountability, a reality that often draws intense public scrutiny. Community leaders have called for calm, while urging residents to cooperate with investigators and support efforts aimed at preventing future violence. Beaumont police have increased patrols in the South Park area in the days following the shooting, both to reassure residents and to deter any retaliatory incidents. Officers reiterated that there is no indication of an ongoing threat to the general public, but encouraged anyone with information to contact authorities, stressing that even small details can be crucial. As the investigation continues, detectives are focused on building a clear and comprehensive case, one that explains not just who is responsible, but how and why a single encounter ended in a life lost. The answers to those questions will shape what happens next in court and how the community understands the tragedy. For now, the case stands at a pivotal moment. A suspect is in custody, a family is mourning, and a neighborhood is left reflecting on how quickly violence can erupt and how lasting its consequences can be. With Charles Siggers now in custody, the Beaumont shooting case has shifted from an urgent manhunt to a methodical legal process, one that will determine accountability for the death of Rudolph Lassaint, 31. Investigators say the transition from active search to court proceedings happened quickly, reflecting the seriousness of the allegations and the speed with which authorities moved once a suspect was identified. After Lassaint was found shot in the South Park neighborhood and later died, detectives worked to establish probable cause. That threshold, required to secure a murder warrant, rests on evidence strong enough to persuade a judge that a crime was committed and that a specific individual likely committed it. Police have not disclosed all the evidence publicly, but they confirmed that investigators gathered witness statements and physical findings sufficient to obtain the warrant. Once the warrant was issued, authorities circulated it internally and publicly, making clear that Siggers was wanted in connection with the killing. Such announcements often heighten tension, particularly in neighborhoods already reeling from violence. In this case, however, the next development de-escalated the situation. Siggers voluntarily turned himself in. Law enforcement officials noted that surrender can reduce the risk of additional harm, and often factors into early procedural considerations, though it does not diminish the gravity of the charge. Siggers was booked into jail and held on a $1.2 million bond, a figure that signals the court's assessment of the charge's seriousness and potential flight risk. In Texas, bond amounts in murder cases can vary widely, influenced by factors such as the nature of the offense, prior history, community ties, and the circumstances of arrest or surrender. A bond at this level places strict conditions on any potential release while the case is pending. With the arrest complete, the case entered the pre-trial phase. Prosecutors will begin the process of formal charging, evidence disclosure, and hearings before a judge. Defense counsel will review the state's evidence, assess potential defenses, and argue issues such as bond conditions or admissibility of evidence. These early steps often shape the trajectory of a case long before a jury is selected. Investigators continue their work during this phase. Homicide cases rarely conclude with an arrest alone. Detectives refine timelines, verify statements, and seek corroboration that strengthens the prosecution's case. Surveillance footage, phone records, and forensic analysis, if applicable, are reviewed to ensure the narrative presented in court aligns with the evidence. Authorities have remained cautious in discussing motive. In many homicide investigations, motive emerges later through witness testimony or digital records, rather than early police statements. Detectives have not publicly confirmed whether Lassaint and Siggers knew each other, or whether the shooting followed a specific dispute. That restraint reflects standard practice aimed at protecting the integrity of the case and avoiding prejudgment. For the South Park community, the suspect's surrender brought a measure of relief, but not closure. Residents described lingering anxiety and sorrow, particularly for Lassaint's family. Police increased patrols in the area, emphasizing visibility and outreach to reassure neighbors and prevent any escalation or retaliation. Community leaders have urged patience and cooperation. They note that while the legal system moves deliberately, public trust depends on transparency and fairness. Witnesses are encouraged to come forward, and police have reiterated that tips can be shared confidentially, an important assurance in neighborhoods where fear of retaliation can silence crucial information. The case also highlights a recurring concern in violent crime investigations. the intersection of youth and firearms. At 18, Siggers is legally an adult, yet still very young, an age that often intensifies public debate about prevention, accountability, and the pathways that lead to deadly outcomes. Officials stress that such discussions do not alter the legal standard in court, but they matter for policy conversations beyond the case itself. As prosecutors prepare for the next hearings, the focus will be on proving elements of the charge: that Lassaint died as a result of a shooting, that the death was unlawful, and that Siggers is criminally responsible. Each element must be established beyond a reasonable doubt for a conviction. Defense counsel will challenge the state's proof, test witness credibility, and explore alternative explanations where possible. For Lassaint's loved ones, the weeks ahead will involve court dates, difficult testimony, and the slow progression of justice. Family liaison officers typically remain in contact, explaining procedures and timelines as the case advances. While the legal process cannot restore what was lost, it offers a structured path toward accountability. At this stage, the story is no longer about pursuit, but proof. A suspect has surrendered, a bond has been set, and the case now rests with the courts to determine what the evidence ultimately shows about a fatal night in Beaumont's South Park neighborhood. With Charles Siggers now held on a $1.2 million bond, the investigation into the killing of Rudolph Lassaint has entered a critical evidentiary phase. This is the point at which a case either coheres into a prosecutable narrative or fractures under scrutiny. For detectives and prosecutors in Beaumont, the task is to align facts, timelines, and testimony into a clear account of what happened in South Park and why. Investigators continue to refine the timeline from the moments before Lassaint was found shot to the steps that followed. In homicide cases, establishing sequence is foundational: where the victim was last seen, who was present, what interactions occurred, and how quickly emergency services were summoned. Each minute matters, and discrepancies, however small, can become pivotal in court. Detectives are therefore revisiting early statements, corroborating them against physical evidence and any available surveillance footage. Witness testimony remains a focal point. In residential neighborhoods like South Park, people may hear gunfire, raised voices, or the sound of vehicles moving quickly away from a scene. Even when witnesses do not see the shooting itself, peripheral observations can anchor a timeline or place individuals in specific locations. Police have emphasized confidentiality for tipsters, recognizing that fear of retaliation can deter cooperation. Prosecutors know that credible, consistent witness accounts often make the difference between suspicion and proof. Physical evidence is being evaluated alongside testimony. While authorities have not disclosed specifics, standard practice includes examining shell casings, trajectory indicators, and any items recovered near the scene that could link a suspect to the shooting. Forensic analysis, ballistics, fingerprints, or trace materials can strengthen or weaken the prosecution's case, depending on what it reveals. Each result must be documented meticulously to withstand cross-examination. Digital evidence is another pillar. Phone records, text messages, and location data can corroborate movements and interactions, especially when timelines are contested. In modern prosecutions, digital footprints often provide neutral confirmation of events, showing where devices were, when communications occurred, and whether narratives align with data. Prosecutors will assess whether such records support the theory of the case or raise new questions requiring explanation. As the evidentiary picture develops, legal strategy takes shape. Prosecutors must establish the elements of murder under Texas law: that Lassaint's death resulted from a shooting, that the act was unlawful, and that the accused is criminally responsible. Defense counsel, in turn, will probe for weaknesses, challenging identification, reliability of witnesses, and the interpretation of forensic findings. Motive, while not always required, can influence juror understanding. Investigators may continue to explore whether a dispute, prior relationship, or other catalyst existed. Beyond the courtroom, the case's impact on the South Park community remains palpable. Residents have described a mix of grief and unease, common after violent incidents that disrupt everyday life. Community leaders and faith organizations have organized quiet vigils and outreach, offering spaces for remembrance and conversation. Such efforts do not alter the legal process, but they reflect a collective need to process loss and reaffirm safety. Law enforcement has maintained a visible presence in the area, both to reassure residents and to prevent any escalation. Officials have reiterated that there is no indication of a broader threat to the public, emphasizing that the investigation is focused and evidence-driven. Maintaining trust during this phase is crucial. Public confidence can encourage cooperation and reduce misinformation. The suspect's age, 18, has also shaped public discussion. While legally an adult, Siggers' youth has prompted conversations about prevention, access to firearms, and the pathways that lead young people into deadly situations. Authorities have been careful to separate policy debates from the facts of the case, underscoring that accountability in court is determined by evidence, not age-based assumptions. For Lassaint's family, the slow cadence of justice is especially difficult. Court proceedings unfold over weeks and months, with hearings that can feel procedural but carry emotional weight. Family liaison officers typically remain engaged, explaining developments and preparing loved ones for what to expect. While no legal outcome can restore what was lost, clarity and due process offer a structured path forward. As pre-trial steps continue, attention will turn to motions, arguments over what evidence the jury may hear, how statements were obtained, and whether any issues warrant exclusion. These rulings can shape the contours of a trial long before opening statements. Prosecutors aim for admissibility and coherence. Defense counsel seeks to narrow the case and test the state's proof. Ultimately, the strength of the case will rest on consistency, whether witness accounts align with physical and digital evidence, whether timelines hold under examination, and whether the narrative remains intact when challenged. That is the work now underway, quiet, methodical, and decisive. For Beaumont, the coming weeks will bring further hearings and, eventually, clearer answers about responsibility for a fatal night in South Park. The investigation has moved beyond pursuit to proof, and the court will determine what the evidence shows. Until then, a family mourns, a community reflects, and the justice system proceeds, step by deliberate step, toward resolution. As this case moves toward its next legal milestones, the focus in Beaumont is shifting from the shock of violence to the steadier work of accountability. The murder of Rudolph Lassaint, 31, has left a family grieving and a neighborhood searching for reassurance. With Charles Siggers, 18, now in custody and held on a $1.2 million bond, the justice system is tasked with answering the central question: what does the evidence prove beyond a reasonable doubt? For prosecutors, the path ahead is about coherence, aligning witness accounts, forensic findings, and digital records into a narrative that stands up in court. For the defense, it is about testing that narrative, scrutinizing procedures, and ensuring every claim meets the legal standard required for conviction. These opposing duties are not obstacles to justice. They are the mechanisms that ensure fairness and accuracy. Beyond the courtroom, the impact on South Park remains real. Residents have spoken of unease, but also of resolve, calls for calm, cooperation with investigators, and support for Lassaint's loved ones. Police presence has increased, emphasizing safety while the case proceeds. Community leaders continue to urge patience, reminding neighbors that justice moves deliberately for a reason. This case also reopens broader conversations about gun violence and youth involvement in serious crime. While policy debates belong outside the courtroom, the loss of life underscores the stakes of prevention, early intervention, and community support. None of these can undo what happened, but they can shape what happens next. As proceedings continue, Beaumont watches closely. The outcome will not erase grief, but it can deliver clarity and responsibility, foundations for healing and trust. If you value fact-checked, responsible reporting that centers truth over speculation, like this video to support serious journalism, share it so others stay informed, and subscribe for more in-depth cinematic news coverage grounded in verified sources.